Hello.
No.
Hello.
Turn this off.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, and welcome to Pregones Theater. My name is Alban Colon here, Associate Artistic Director, and I am really, really very proud that we're able to host this event because our relationship with En Foco goes back to
Over 20 years?
over 20 years, like 40. And I leave you now with Mr. Bill Aguado. Thank you. You know, Alban Colon and the family here at Pregones with College ESCME and Rankin By and some of the others in the late 70s, early 80s going forward. It's about legacy organization. It's about memories. It's about archives. It's about history. And today we have a panel that's drawn from our archives about Sophie Rivera, the first woman who was really acknowledged. First Latina, first original So, and we see our archive becoming a source of programming. These assets are magically kept in dusty shelves, but they can be shared with all of you. So I do want to thank everyone for coming here today, and we'll have a short reception afterwards. And we have a very unique and wonderful panel here. Many who I've known for a lot of years. And one person who I don't know very well, I haven't known for that many years, is our new managing director, who will be the moderator.
Before we begin, I'd just like to echo Bill and thank all of you for joining us today. Again, I'm Oscar Rivera. I'm the managing director here at En Foco, and on the panel we have artist, educator, superstar. Oh, can you guys hear me, or should I use one of these?
They're recording.
It's on? Great. Ooh, I don't like the sound of my voice. Again, thank you guys for joining us today. It's not the night yet. I'm joined by Marisol Díaz, artist, educator, one of our superstars. Nina Kuo, who's also an artist and an activist, and then Rocio Aranda-Alvarado, who is, it's a mouthful. Also a curator and educator who worked with Sophie. So before we jump in, I'm just gonna ask you guys introduce yourselves, and then tell us a little bit about how you knew Sophie, how'd you meet her, just a little bit more about her as a person, an artist, an activist, wherever the spirit takes you.
So my name is Marisol Díaz, and I got to know En Foco through an internship back in 1998. A few months later, I started working at En Foco, and one of the things that Miriam and Charles would do at that time is give me a stack of Nueva Luz magazines and say, here, just, you know, there's nothing else to do, but maybe you should pass your time in getting to know the organization. And of course, the first issue is Sophie's, right? The first cover, Latina, Puerto Rican, and I was starstruck, right? Because I grew up in an institution, the universities, in which we didn't see people like myself in books and magazines as photographers, right? That's not the way we were depicted. They were always non-whites, so nothing to take away from them, but we just were not represented. So it's very challenging for someone to sit in an institution and try and figure out where their path is and if there's availability for them down the road if you're not being representative, right? So when I saw her, I thought, you know, my professor in photography who pointed me to En Foco, I thought, he was right. This is the place for me, right? This is where I can see others like me producing things that I want to produce, right? In different ways with their own subjectivity and their own experience. So seeing Sophie's work and seeing her on the first issue of the magazine just changed my life. You know, that was just another check mark that said, you know, you're doing the right thing. You belong in this medium, and move forward. So then eventually I did meet her, and I would speak to her on the phone and interact with her. She was very active coming into the shows as best as she could, along with her husband. So that was my introduction. It's that magazine, that publication that was so inspiring.
Hi, I'm Nina Kuo, and Sophie was like a fellow cohort. We would go to openings, talk on the phone, and as a fellow artist, we would, I guess, be inspired by all the New York art scene, you know, and other painters and so forth. And I think because of her interest in not just photography, she was really engaging in the theatrical and the drama and looking at how the subjects were out there, but they also came to her. You know, they were magnetized into her world. So I think, you know, we shared so much, and in the 80s, when I met her, early 80s, I was a theater artist. I met Dawood. Dawood gave a talk, and he was giving all kinds of workshops at En Foco, and it was great. I got to meet all the early, you know, pioneers. I have to really give them that pioneer label of heroism. But Sophie was there. She, you know, we would talk about Lisette Moudel and how I think in some ways we weren't really in that same camp. You know, we saw all the other women and the feminists and the art world spinning around on the Soho scene and the Lower East Side scene. But I think, you know, we knew we had to do it on our own terms. And then Pests came out in '86 and '87 with Howardina Pendel's guidance and Janet Henry, and it was a very small group, which we'll talk about later. And I think, you know, it was very magical, you know, and a struggle too, you know, with all that pain and rejection, skepticism. I mean, all these adjectives I'm throwing in make us really see her work on that level.
Dia, it's so nice to see you all here. Thanks for coming. I was just trying to remember the first time I saw Sophie's name. Sorry, I have a cold, which is why I'm sitting over here and keeping my mask on. I'm sorry. I was trying to remember the first time I saw Sophie's name. I think I must have been doing research at El Museo del Barrio. You know, something that's really good for everyone to know and pass on to everyone. You know, museums are a resource, and they keep archives of all the artists that they have in their collection or artists that they've shown. And those are really rich files that are publicly accessible. You just make an appointment. I'm sure that's where I saw her work for the first time in one of the artist files. And at that time, I was working at Jersey City Museum. I was responsible for one gallery where we had shows by living artists, small solo shows. And when I saw her work, I knew immediately that she would be perfect for that space. And so I reached out and made an appointment to meet with her and got to see a lot of her work. And it changed. I mean, I feel like there was a lot of really great things that came out of that solo show for her. And, you know, as a result, I think her work is in additional collections, which is really, when work gets seen, just like Bill is saying, like those things should not be put away. We should be seeing them, because that's how they get into other collections and people are able to see them.
Yeah, And just to add to that, that's one of the reasons that we've been working so hard to preserve Sophie's work and her legacy and make it part of the Nueva Luz Study Center, because outside of those institutions, where can you find that information? How do people who aren't, students or academics or attached to institutions like ours, how do they find out about the people that have come before them? Where do those spaces exist for them? And with that, we'll move on to the second question. We've been talking a little bit about the 70s and the 80s and how difficult, that landscape was, specifically in the world of photography. How, in your experience, did female artists make their mark? How were they able to get their work shown and appreciated? And how has that been like for you, an artist like Sophie? Anyone can take this one.
So I could tell you that spending time at En Foco on Mondays and Tuesdays, it was what I call Charlie Day, because that's when he would come in from way upstate and drive in. And as a documentarian, I watch, right? I watch people's behaviors, but there's also a listening process that happens with that. And being around Charlie, that was my role. I listened, because I understood that he had broken his ground, and then also starting En Foco, and he had very specific reasons why he did that. And one of the reasons was because of lack of representation for people of Puerto Rican ancestry, and then it opened up to people of color. One of the things he said to me in many, many conversations, and this struck me, and I was actually horrified. He says, yes, when women were allowed to exhibit in galleries and museums, it was mostly in the summer. And it struck me, and I said, well, why is that? He says, because people go on vacation. And that means it's also like a token. You were talking about tokens before. They're saying, look, we do show women, right? But to what audience? If the audience that's there during the rest of the season is not there, so who's actually getting access to these female artists? And then you add a layer of ethnicity to it. And we also have the issue of our own communities not understanding or appreciating the quality of artists that they have, right? I mean, we're at Pregones, and this is a perfect place to have this conversation. So there were so many layers, and that's what, Charlie would talk about this to me, and being Puerto Rican and what that means, or New York Rican, and it has a weight. So I don't know all the details of what happened to Sophie, but I know that in order for me to understand who I was and who I was capable of being, I had to be at En Foco, because that's where I was able to see Sophie, Nitza Luna, Rita Rivera, and all these other Puerto Rican artists. And I say that, but I did write a paper in 2002 because I was saddened by the lack of representation in our classroom, the university system. And it had to do with Nitza Luna and Sophie. And I'm still looking for that 20-plus-year-old essay. I found half of it, so the other half is like a little scavenger hunt. But I wanted to teach my professor, because what he was teaching and the demographics of the classroom he was teaching in were very, very vast. And it was a desert, right? We couldn't meet in the middle because there was no middle. So I purposely brought it En Foco into the institutions, and I currently teach at Queens College, and I bring in the magazine, and I talk about people that look like my students without apologies. Yes, we'll talk about Ansel Adams and all. That's fine. But if you come to my classroom, this is the kind of education you're gonna get. People that look like you, that sound like you, that came before you, that have succeeded, that have struggled, that are male, female, gender nonconforming, whoever it is, that's so, and it's important because, again, I mentioned it before, you're gonna go into roadblocks, and one of the things I've learned in this life is the only way you can succeed in whatever that means to you is if you are true to who you are and you can accomplish the reason why you're here. And En Foco has done that for me, and Nita Luna, Sophie has done that for me as well.
Well, there's so many memories that I have, and I think as a curator, I was blessed because she included me in work at the Catskill Center for Photography in '91 called Diversity and Ethnicity. She was very thorough, and I think the kind of self-curated art skills you learn are through En Foco and artists that tried to expand the inclusion of all people of color, because it was the kind of omission that we experienced, and it was shocking because there was so much talent pools out there, and then in '86 and '87, Sophie and us, Janet Henry and others, joined in with Howardina Pindell to do these newsletters that were circulated around galleries, and they were mailed out, and it was the low tech putting up the posters around walls, and they were torn down right after, of course. But she did a lot of the Latin American artists news, sorting through and finding the richness, and then we would publicize it in the newsletter, and you'll see that in the slideshow later. But I think that the main goal of PES was that PES's mission is to publicize the myopia of the art establishment, the serious omission and de facto censorship practiced by galleries, museums, and art publications. We wanted to make a clever decision in using the insect, the little bugs, to sting back. And of course, you know, it was the statistics, the hardcore statistics that were put together by PES that really showed our non-inclusion and the kind of passing over of our existence. So that's something I think Sophie had a major part in. Thanks.
And PES arose because of the sexism of the art world.
Yeah, I mean, it was everything. It was everything all encapsulated.
It's sort of like Guerrilla Girls, like you gathered data about how exclusionary the male-centered and male-dominated art world was, and made that made the public aware of that, right? Oh, so you know, Sophie, one of the things you do as a curator, right, is you do as much research as possible into your subject, the artist, as when you're organizing the exhibition. So I started with research, and I wish I could remember which publication this was, and I can't find that essay. Like Marisol, I'm still looking for it. But I found an article that she wrote. She did a review of 2 new photography books that had just been published. They were big, thick books, surveys of photography. And she did a review of them, and she counted how many women were produced in these books, and they were, you know, you could probably count it on one hand, honestly. And so her entire essay really was about the negligence, really, in writing a complete history of photography and leaving out entirely half of the population. And so she was a feminist. She was a feminist. And just recently, a student of mine was looking up, she was writing about Sophie also, and I found another feminist text that she had written on one of these, like, literally typewritten newsletters that women artists were working on in the 1970s in order to protest their lack of representation in the art world. Yeah, so she was really active in writing about it, and not only making her own work, but seeing how women, you know, could be better represented. Also, she was included in a show, this was also at a Museo del Barrio, I want to say it was late 70s or early 80s, it was an exhibition called Comadres, and it was 9 women photographers, each of whom I'm sure deserves their own solo show. So anybody who is interested in doing some research in that direction, there's so much work to be done.
Let us know if you are. You know, in many ways, all the research that we've been doing about Sophie has really shown us how forward-thinking she was. She foresaw a lot of these issues decades before that they've become, you know, really popular in the way that artists and just general folks have been moving around in the world. You know, and we look at her work, and she was using her lens as a way to reveal the humanity of folks, specifically with the Puerto Rican series. So, ooh, I lost my question. Can you? Yeah. Can each of you speak a little bit about her process as you knew it, and what are the parts of her work that really move you and have stood with you? Because I know for me, the validation that she provided some folks was really, you know, I think about it all the time, and it is one of the reasons that I do the work that I do. So I'm just interested to hear from you guys. Anyone can take it.
It's interesting because when the Sophie show came out here at Pregones, of course I had to include it in my lesson plan, and in class we watched Photographic the Bronx, right? Because that was like the factor that led to the show that's outside. So I mean, my students are undergrads, they're in their 20s, and here I am playing this movie. And then I posed them the question, and I said, how do you feel after watching an hour of this? We're not gonna watch the whole thing, I'll fast forward some parts. What do you think? And they immediately said, they're stereotypes. Okay, which ones? How the Blacks are portrayed, how the Puerto Ricans are portrayed, how the police behave within the community space. And then I introduced Sophie, and I explained that she basically was shining a light on a Puerto Rican from a Puerto Rican point of view, right? This is, and you know, I was reading about it too, that she would just say, hey, are you Puerto Rican? And Sophie was not a tall woman. She didn't have a big presence. Sophie spoke softly. She was Zen. So I'm imagining her in the street, polling people after asking if they're Puerto Rican. I don't know what I would do if someone would just say, oh, you're Puerto Rican, I'm like, why, right? But somehow she got a few people to agree to this.
I saw her as not a shy person. I saw her as a very, no, I mean, she was, I think she was feisty and ambitious. She knew where she wanted to go, and I think that was what we all, I think, I think we grew into this kind of world of, you know, learning how to overcome those obstacles. You know, when people say things about your ethnicity, and I learned from her, you know, the whole community, and not only the community, the culture, you know, the real wealth of the culture. And I think she took that from me too, because, you know, everything that was going on in her world was going on very in similar ways for Asian Americans and Chinese Americans especially. And we have a long history and the colonialism and everything. But, you know, I think I agree with you that, you know, she could elevate and to being part of that inner circle of the Puerto Rican viewpoint and the feminists, and also sassing back, you know, with her, you know, portraits. I think that they were very, you know, like stark and very demanding. You know, they weren't quiet pictures, you know, and she had this 2¼ Yashica 124G, and we talk about, you know, how to print this and do, you know, do all the technical things you want with flashes and so forth. I mean, that's another struggle, you know, to deal with a darkroom at home or, you know, in a smelly lab and being in there, you know, forever, it seemed. And you know, it wasn't good for your health, and it wasn't good for a lot of things, but you really endured it, and she had her whole family of us, I think, and that you know, helped to I think bring about her process, and learning how to montage pictures, and she did that a lot with you know, because you could crank up the camera and not you know, advance it, and so all little tricks and things. It was very you know, like, so private, yet, you know, they come out in a very, I don't know, sort of seductive manner.
So maybe she was gentle with me because it's because you were younger. I mean, yes, you knew her at a different time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, there were very few jobs. The economy was like, forget it. The, you know, freelancing and so forth, and you know, getting the grants or getting some recognition, and you know, and I was lucky. I was part of the NISCA SAS, Special Arts Service auditor position, so I could go around and look at all the different diversity of this, and we talk about that, and we'd say, how can we help to parlay that into the real deserving art, you know, endeavor for the future. And yeah, you have to give up your artwork in order to do that, you know, to learn, to acquire those skills and be the curatorial person or being the scholar that is expected.
Yeah, I mean, I think her process is amazing. I was thinking that's something we could all do after we're done here, collectively lobby for the Museum of the City of New York to acquire the subway painter images, which is another thing she did, like flipping the, I think also thinking about invisibility and who isn't depicted, right, number one, but also flipping the gaze. So it's a female photographer looking at these workers for the MTA who were painting the 125th Street overpass. You know, such great photographs that I think belong in a museum collection that are about the history of New York City and specifically the MTA. But that thing about finding the invisibilized image and creating it, you know, the process of asking people from the neighborhood who are walking by, the level of trust that was required on both parts, right, for people to agree to come and sit for their portrait in her studio, in her home. And I think the results are just, I mean, they're fantastic, which is why these photos have been acquired and are in museum collections. They're incredibly powerful. And she was trying to fill this gap that she saw. She was growing up Puerto Rican in New York, never being in any books or magazines or films or TV. And it makes me think actually of the work of Pepón Osorio, the 1993 work, 1992-93 work, Whose Crime, that was in that Whitney Biennial exhibition, and was just recently reinstalled at the New Museum, first in that new show that was about 1993 as a year, and then they just did it, you know, for his solo show there. The same impulse, I think, is what inspired Pepón to think about who is not represented in the mass media and who is misrepresented, right? He's asking, whose crime is it? And so Sophie is taking that same sort of idea and thinking about how to represent Puerto Ricans in a way where they're not only one-dimensional Fort Apache, the Bronx stereotypes. And they're almost religious, you know, like the light that she shines on to get the photograph correct has this little halo of light and the wood paneling behind it. It just, they're really majestic and almost holy, almost sacred.
They're also confrontational. Like you can't, you're forced to look them in their eyes and contend with their full humanity. And I think about when this work was installed at Yankee Stadium on the MTA, what that must have been like for people in that neighborhood to see their community members printed huge, just in there taking up space and existing, and how impactful that must have been for them. and you know, a gift that Sophie gave all of us. So Nina, you mentioned pest earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about what drove Sophie's activism? I know we've touched on it here, but what really inspired her to get involved, and you know, how did that come through in her work?
I think all of us were serious, dedicated artists, and that's something that drove us to drop everything and to do these newsletters and to kind of like realize that this was negated from art history. And so and during that time, also, Howardina Pindell was working on a show, and it included major women of color, like Teresa Cha and Adrian Piper, all these really great people, and Jane Quick to see. And I think it was during that time when she felt that she could really make a true feminine radical tour de force book, and she made a series of her own feces, and that was very shocking, and I think it made people turn into this. Well, why this? Why are you? And but I thought it had a humorous side too, and a very sardonic and very personal, and it, I think that she knew that photography was a tool that is so powerful that you're not looking at just another person's reality. Her reality is something where she knew had to evolve, and I think that was a really I think just so many memories come through that, where she wanted to be a writer. She knew she wanted to get out there and experience so many of the turning points of New York City life in that decade, And there was one conference that was held at Hunter. It was called The Art World and Racism, Testimony, Documentation, and Statistics. That was a report that Howardina gave, but the conference title was called Agendas for Survival. And during that time, Pest made a kind of like a musical chant about how the art world, is ignoring us, and that we're not going to stand for that. We're not going to put it up with that. So, it was kind of like a mimic slogan, and no one could tell who we were, but we were there anonymously. And it was, the way that I think the kind of activism started to bring us to like a stronger and a kind of like sense of who we are as artists, not just decorating and making prints for sale or whatever, because we knew that wasn't going to happen for a long time. But it was it was really gutsy.
Either of you want to add to that?
And heresies. She did a lot of work with heresies. And other.
I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you, I'm sorry, you talked about the images with the feces, right? But in my interview from 20-something years ago, that I can't remember all the details, Sophie spoke about a work that she did with tampons. Do you remember that? Because I have, I'm trying to remember the conversation with her, but it goes to the line of feminism and taboo. But she would photograph her bloody tampon in the toilet, right? Which a lot of people would cringe at. But this is something that's perfectly natural that happens to us females. Do you want to say?
I saw those photographs and also the feces photographs the first time I went to visit her to talk about the show we would do at Jersey City Museum. And I just went, you know, thinking about it now, I just think she was ahead of her time in thinking about what art historians later called the abject and its ties to the female body in particular. And I just think that that work would be so perfect right now for so many, you know, exhibitions that are about, you know, the wake of Roe v. Wade, right? Something like that. I know I heard she was, I think, always really thoughtful about this lack of opportunities for women and all the other ways that women were left out of conversations and possibilities and opportunities.
Yeah, and it adds how much she was considering the agency that women weren't always afforded in those spaces, especially as a photographer. You know, she was light years ahead of us. So just to move on to the next question, we know that she lost a lot of her work to a studio fire. And that's made really finding a lot of, you know, what she did challenging for us. And so my question is, do you know anything about what that was like for her? And then just to stick in a second part, what's your best advice for artists to make sure that they're documenting and protecting their work so that these kinds of tragedies aren't prevalent? Anyone can take it.
I was just going to say really quickly, you know, like the Joan Mitchell Foundation also started thinking about the issues of archiving, especially for older artists who have a large body of work and decades of work behind them. And so they had this excellent program where they would pair a younger artist, emerging artist, with an older artist and help them get all of their work in order. But it's so important to archive the work. And now, you know, with the digital world that we live in, it's so much easier, I think, to archive things than it was in the past. You know, I think also for people doing research, I remember finding that article that she wrote in the, what do you call that little strip of film? Microfiche. It was on microfiche at the New York Public Library. So I know New York Public Library is like digitizing a lot of stuff, but microfiche is like you literally have to go in person and find this stuff. So, I mean, it's good that it's preserved, but it's not always easy to find. So yes, crucial to document your work.
I also know that Society of Photographic Education, which was called SPE, did conferences, and we would go, and I know that there's some papers that are housed at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So that's another step of, I'm sure a lot of your people and people, myself, we gave talks there, and I'm sure she's mentioned there. So I guess a lot of it has to be a slow process where new, younger academics and scholars or just volunteers are really, you know, keen on this. And of course, restoring when she had that fire, she called me and she wanted to use my bathroom, and mine wasn't big enough for all the, you know, the dirt, and I said I couldn't put that down my drain, but ultimately she borrowed somebody and she paid, her insurance didn't cover the loss, but she did borrow a bigger industrial sink to wash everything, and I think she was able to salvage a lot of it. Or, yeah, I'm not sure how much.
So Sophie was famous for calling the organization once every month or every 2 months. So we would actually get worried when the Sophie call didn't come in. Because it was a pleasure to pick up the phone and hear her voice and her thoughts. And mostly she would call in to say, hey, when's the next Nueva Luz coming? You know, her concern was for the artists. You know, she wanted to see works continue to come out. She was appreciative of En Foco. She would show up as much as she could to the shows, and that was a pleasure. But I remember one of those phone calls she made, she called and said to me that she had a fire. And as an artist, my heart sank, right? And as someone who's been through the Bronx fires in the 70s, flashback, but at this level for her, her photography as her language. So I was deeply saddened by it, and she mentioned negatives and photographs, and what I'm thinking is, this is irreplaceable art, right? Whoever saw it, they had the privilege of seeing it, and if it's been reproduced, that's the only place that you can see it again. But she was, to her credit, she did what she could, and we talked about it in the office. My concern as an artist, besides the fires, is I'm going to use myself as an example. We talked about this earlier. What happens when I pass, right? What is my family going to do with all this work? Do they actually know who to reach out to, or is it just going to get collected and dumped? You know, there's slides, there's black and white, there's color, there's CDs, DVDs, zip drives, external drives, like 20 of them, right? Big ones, small ones, different ports. So it's a nightmare when I'm asked to look for something that's over 20 years old. I almost want to say, I can't find it. I don't want to, it's going to take me a very long time to get that information. So when I work with my clients, I immediately put things in a cloud for them. So at least the selected files or the artwork that's selected, that's edited, is in a cloud-based system, and my hard drives are my backup systems. Maybe not the originals, because that's a lot of memory space, but at least those are out there. And in the process for looking for Sophie's paper, I reconsidering, going through little by little through these DVDs and figuring out how to crack them open and put them into a cloud base, because once I'm gone, what's going to happen with the work, right? So one of the things I've implemented is put pressure on my husband, and I've said, any day I can go. It can truly happen. You just don't know. And my concern is for all the energy and effort that I've put into my craft, right? So I've said, you need to contact En Foco, make a call to Juan Sanchez. Between them, they will figure something out. But my work is through my children, right? So my advice would be, don't wait until you're older to have these conversations with your family members. I just had that conversation with you, so you're in for it. Because you just don't know, right? Like right now with Sophie, I was terrified for the fire when it happened. And then I was heartbroken when she passed, right? And we talked about how I was going to focus, where's Sophie? I haven't heard about Sophie. And then a few months later, she passes. So that's my advice. Have that hard conversation, because once you're gone, no one's going to know what this is. It's going to look like junk to some people, because they won't be able to open it. They won't be able to access it. They can't archive it. Make your circle, make the plans, write it down.
And just to add, I think that the more work that we've been doing with our archiving, we think that digitization is sort of the final step. And the more that technology advances, things become obsolete. And ways that you thought you were protected and that your work has been secured, in 5 years, you won't be able to access it. Then you have to figure out how to sort of break back into things. And that's a hurdle that we've had to cross as well, just with things that the organization has done in the past. So always be thinking about the future in that way. And since you've mentioned Sophie's passing, she passed in, I think, the summer of 2021. And since then has been getting a lot of attention. And while we love to see that, and she's become a real pillar of our communities, but I wonder what is driving that now. why wasn't she receiving this attention when she was alive? She was compared to Abadan a lot. She is someone that we all know and are familiar with, but why wasn't she a household name, do you think?
In part, it's something we were just talking about right before we started, which is a lack of people passing on their knowledge in academic environments, right? None of us had POC professors, and it's my passion, your passion, all of our collective passion to do this work and to share it with others, but we're only a handful, right? Until there's, I think, a critical mass of people who are passing on their knowledge. This is why we don't know, and she's not a household name, even though she should be. She and probably all those other 8 comadres who were in that show at El Museo, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's an endless amount of people who we could be retrieving from the annals of art history that haven't been included, which is why we need to just rethink that entire history and break it open and teach it in different ways.
I actually grew tired of hearing about artists like Sophie, and I am grateful that she's acquired and she's at the Whitney, and I saw the show. I brought my students there, and I'm grateful that I saw other En Foco members at the Whitney, including Lola Flash and a few others. My memory is not as good as it used to be, and I'm looking around on the 3rd floor, by the way. I don't know if they still have the show up, but if you went to the 3rd floor a few months ago, about 50 to 60% of the artists there came through the En Foco doors at some point in their life, okay? When I would go years ago and watch these photo shows, I would have this little game with myself, and it started with Charlie. Right? And it usually starts with Charlie, that I started reading the names of the artists. I go, oh, Mariana Yampolsky, En Foco. So-and-so, En Foco. Okay, so out of all of this, I recognize 5. And the 5 I recognize came through the doors. Everyone else, I can't really tell their ethnicity, but I have a feeling that they're not people of color, right? I also played this little game when doing my research, and I would go around asking people, how many Puerto Rican female photographers do you know? And someone actually said, I don't know, I think it's just you. And I was horrified. It's like, no, that's not the case, right? Like, so that's what really kicked off this. But I think a lot of us have grown tired of hearing about these amazing artists who use this medium as their language after the fact, right? Where it's not coming from an ego based, but where is their appreciation and acknowledgement when they're here, when they can actually receive that extra push to go even further, right? Instead of having to work in small communities, which is fine. But what happens is that, again, our community cannot be acknowledged if we cannot put a mirror to it. And that's been the argument for decades and decades and decades, right? For people of color. Aside from giving females shows in the summer, we need to really open up these museums, these institutions. We need to educate our students. It needs to be written in university books. The lectures need to happen. The artists need to get an honorarium to come into the institutions and give these talks, not do it for free. They should get paid so that others would know. The acknowledgement needs to happen while they're alive, not while they're past. What's the point of it?
I think that was beautifully said. We want to make sure that everyone can add to the conversation while they're still here, and they can be, give them their flowers while they're around to receive them. And before we open the floor up for questions, our goal today was to really share Sophie with as many folks as we could. And I'm going to ask each of you just if there's any special moment or anything that is dear to your heart about Sophie that you would like to share with us.
I'll share about a series of photographs that folks here had not seen or heard of, and I didn't realize that Martin Hurwitz had also passed. May they both rest in peace together. When I first visited Sophie, one of the series that she showed me was the portraits that she did every year of Martin on Valentine's Day. And they were nude portraits. And you know, it's a really interesting thing. She was thinking along the same lines that other photographers have done also, where they photograph the same family members every year, once a year. But to see that kind of visual love poem to her husband, I think said a lot about who she was as an artist and as a woman, as a family unit.
I'd like to read her novella. She would read parts of it to me on the phone, but with all the noise from being at the workplace and it's not the ideal setting, but I think if we could dig that up and really look at it.
So again, I'm having like these memory issues these days, especially because the events were so long ago. But when I began writing that paper, and you have to understand, I was very starstruck with a lot of the artists whose work I saw in the magazine, and meeting them. It was like meeting someone from Hollywood tenfold, right? So when I asked Sophie if she could give me her time to interview her for this college paper, and she politely says yes, then I'm allowed to go into her home. And I remember the white walls, but what I remember was the radio. It was a weekend. And I think it might have been opera that she was listening to. And there was a sense of peacefulness and calm. And she made me feel okay in her home. And then we just began talking. Well, she talked, I listened, took notes, and recorded. But that was a gift, right? And that's not something that everyone will say yes to. But when you receive it, you need to acknowledge it. She didn't have to do that for me, but she cared enough and she wanted to do it. So I just remember that feeling of being around her.
That's beautiful. And I thank each of you for sharing so much of your experiences and your memories of Sophie with us. You know, the well of knowledge about her on the internet is sort of finite, and we've been doing all of the digging that we can, and it's hard to connect things back. And right before we let all you guys in, we were talking about how hard it is to connect the writing pieces that she had been, that she had published, to making sure that it's actually her. So if you see anything on there, let us know. But we've, this has been a real treat for me to listen to all of you, especially as the folks that knew her personally and have shared space with her. So again, I thank you. And if any of you guys have questions, we will open the floor up now.
I want to thank everyone, for all the panelists, because the insights on Sophie, for those of us who knew Sophie, know a very quiet, reserved person. To listen to all of you prior to this and to this panel, it made a person out of the image of Sophie. But this would not have happened, and it points to an issue that was raised. If the estate, if Sophie's estate didn't get in touch with me last year, and if we didn't go out there, and I offered to take the ephemera and the slides so that we can copy it and preserve it in our archives, that brought about the interest for us, but we started realizing this was a person, this was an artist. She was on the cover of Volume 1, Number 1. And we have to do something. So the exhibit in this institution was not an accident. The panel was not an accident. But if that estate did not get in touch with us, they offered us, 500 pieces of art? And, you know, it's like also when Frank Espada's son called me, he said, I have 500,000 pieces, I have 500,000 slides. Do you want it? So the issue for us, for me, is how do we preserve these legacies? Not just Sophie's, George Malave, who's sitting in the audience, Michael Palmer, who's here, Marisol, Nina. These are all parts of our history. And how I don't consider us an institution that collects. I consider us an institution that is an information hub and that preserves the legacy and information. So having George linked to us, having Sophie, that additional information added to our archives. But it's hardly enough. And how many are lost along the way? And that's the sad part. Too many of our colleagues, too many of the artists, too many members of our community, their voices are lost.
Thanks, Bill. I'm not sure that there was an actual question, and so I'm going to open up and see if anyone else. I see some hands. You guys want to make your way over here and get in the line for me? Oh, okay, yeah. So we'll start. We'll walk a little. Yeah.
Okay, I see there's quite a few people here, so I'll be very brief. Thank you. Very honored to be here. Learned about this event, I think, randomly throughout the week. I'm just being more intentional about connecting with my Boricua side. So this is great. My question, it's a bit loaded, so bear with me. I'm going to do my best to contextualize it as needed. So let me just first state, I think it's very important to, for lack of better words, segment all of the different identities and make sure that there's space being made, especially when we talk about women, for obvious reasons. Y'all did an amazing job with that. Personally, I'm struggling, because, especially with how diced up my identity is, right? I'm struggling with how do we ride that line? Because I think it was, yes, Marisol, you were saying, you're asking about, do you know any other Puerto Rican women photographers, where the answer is only you, whereas you could just ask if there was Puerto Rican photographers, the answer might still be the same. And so it's obviously women need to be advocated in a very particular way. I'm a Moreno that happens to be a Boricua, so obviously you could imagine that, right? Because we're additionally marginalized within, Latinidad as a whole. So I don't want to intrude, because this is a very intentional, we're honoring Sophie, right? So I don't want to take away, but I'm curious if there's any skills, best practices, or insights, genius that, y'all be able to parse out in regards to how people can do justice to that situation while focusing on what we're focusing on now, but also not kind of missing opportunities. I hope I did that justice.
Okay. Yeah, my name was mentioned. I. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, that my turning point was En Foco, right? But let's go a little further back. I didn't understand there was a problem, right? I was in that place of ignorance and accepting what I was being taught and not realizing that I could be that too, right? Because I wasn't represented. And it was Professor Bruce Habiger at City College, who I won't go into all the details, but he brought me into his office and he said the obvious. He says, "You're Latina, you're Puerto Rican, New York Rican, you're a tiny woman." And he said a couple other things, and they were all factual. There's nothing to be argued about. And then he says, "And you need to meet these people." And he showed me Nueva Luz. That was the turning point, because that's when it reminded me of the first time I noticed my complexion was different and that it was a problem. And I was about 5 years old. And I won't go into that story, but it was like that moment of, oh, he's bringing me here because I'm going to graduate soon and I'm not going to have the support system that I have with him. And I am going to go out there in this desert, right? So he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. So what I would say to you is find your tribe and grow in your tribe. So when you go out into that desert, you have the tools, right? And you're going to have to go back to that tribe again and renew yourself again, because it may not be as easy as we think, you know, get a support system, it'll be fine. No. You still may have more work to do. And the tough thing for me to say to you is that work is continuous. It's not ending, and it may never end. So I hope that I answered your question. Okay.
Oh, okay. My question is real quick, but thanks for panelists. I actually met Sophie at City College as well when she was writing at the creative writing MFA. And I think what you have there is the novel of the girl getting caught in the meat cleaver, because that's what she was writing, this really wonderful novel about a girl growing up and tragedy had happened. But I remember I knew who she was because I had seen her in Museo del Barrio. I'd seen her portraits and I loved them. And I always wanted to ask her, and I chickened out. Always we chicken out, we always talk about something else. And the question to you is, that I wanted to ask her is, she must have done films. She must have done, digital was coming in. No, you didn't need to get the actual film and develop it. You actually had digital. So I'm wondering, do you guys know if she has any shorts? She must have some short films somewhere. She must have filmed something.
That's a really good question. You're right. I mean, there's so many people who did photography who also were interested in film, and there was so much crossover. I think it's a question for the estate. That I know of, when I visited her, she didn't show me any films.
Thank you so much, panelists, for hosting this event. I was actually just wondering if you could describe the first time meeting Sophie Rivera and your impressions of her. And Ms. Alvarado, thank you. I know that you've already described a little bit about that. I was hoping to start with you and make our way down.
Well, you know, it's funny. My impression was very much like Marisol's, but and then I met Sophie when she was older. She was very quiet. She spoke as if she might have had a small stroke at some point, you know? But she didn't seem old at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, her hair was still dark, and she was really interested in talking about her work. And she wasn't afraid. You know, she showed me the fecal photos. She showed me the bloody tampon photos, you know, black and whites, and some in color. She showed me everything. So she was very open. And I think really happy to have someone interested in her work and talking about it. And she was really excited about having a solo exhibition, even if it was in a small gallery in a small museum across the river. She was very generous. She was very generous.
Well, I met Sophie through the photo network. I guess it was the uptown scene and mingling with the downtown photo, I guess, you know, the photo people that kind of, we stood out because we were, I guess really different, you know. And Sophie was very curious. She was interested in Asian culture and African American and other, you know, cultures that were I think not accessible to her when she was younger. And I think when you ask that question about your being close to your tribe, I think sometimes your tribe is the person or those that had the same passion. And extending yourself, going to a foreign land, or even in New York, I feel that camaraderie, that kind of connection, it's got to be physically there, you know. And I'm really glad that it wasn't just, you know. I think I lost touch with Sophie was because of the internet, and you know, having to type everything out and not really knowing the proper words or the language of the internet. So I can't deal with all that high-tech conversation. I love the phone calls that she had with people, and you know, and she actually smoked, and I would yell at her for her, you know, dark cigarettes and, you know, strong eyeglasses. I wore my dark eyeglasses just for her honor. And she wore, you know, like leather boots and tight, you know, jeans. So she was really, you know, tough lady. And I think, you know, I think all of the people that she associated with were tough, you know. And you had to be really kind of like having this, you know, attitude of, you know, like, I'm not taking this, you know, crap. You know, it extended beyond, you know, her I think her mindset.
It's interesting you talk about the glasses, because I think that's Linda right there. And Linda worked with us at En Foco, and she knows Sophie as well, and she knows about the Sophie phone calls. And yeah, I mean, we do know Sophie. We recognize the glasses, these dark glasses. She was very elegant looking, dressed really well. I can't say when was the first time I met her, because I met her multiple times, right? And I can't even say when was the first time I spoke to her. All I can say is that seeing that cover and meeting her, there is, you know, some people get goosebumps when they fall in love or something like that. That's the kind of feeling and appreciation that I felt hearing her name or seeing her work, or finally like meeting her when I met her. It's like, this is icon, right? It's a living ancestor of sorts, right? In the photography world, that you can have conversations with, you can touch, right? And she was gentle with us. She always asked about how we were doing, right? That's what she called. Linda's shaking her head. That she called to find out how the staff of En Foco was doing. And then she called, and then she says, how's the magazine? And when is it coming? And what else do you have coming up next? And, you know, she also gave donations to the organization. And this was a constant. And I believe she did that because she believed in the mission of the organization, and it was hand in hand with her mission.
Oh, you guys hold on. Any other questions? I see Tina here. Right here. Yeah. But can we see how well? One second. Oh, okay. So I can actually answer that. So we have the exhibit out in the hall, but if you also visit the En Foco website, the exhibit has been replicated digitally and includes an additional few pieces from our permanent collection. She's also been acquired by the Smithsonian, so there are a couple of her pieces there, and on view at the Whitney. Because of the studio fire and the way that she worked, there aren't many pieces out on the internet, but she is in a couple places, and you can find the books that she's published on Amazon.
Well, it's really
everyone saying how they met Sophie. I didn't know her well, but I am familiar with Sophie. I met her on a number of occasions on the Lower East Side because I worked at Kenkellaba Gallery, and she also had exhibited there, and she was sort of part of the scene. But I find it interesting, everyone's impression of Sophie, because I never thought of her. I am Puerto Rican, and I never thought of her as a Puerto Rican. I just thought of her as an artist, and who just so happened to be a woman. But I just saw her as a photographer, as an artist, and a person who knew what she wanted and knew how to maneuver in order to make sure her presence was known. And I always thought it was fascinating. Yes, a visual impression, but what I always thought was fascinating, just as a person, that she always had the support of her husband with her. And since you mentioned the image that she would take Valentine's Day, and I didn't know he had passed away either, but that, for me, Sophie is always associated with her husband. So I don't know her well, but I knew that because of having him, she was able to do what she wanted and needed to do, which is very important. And yes, now we're dealing with her at this time. She is a woman. She's a Puerto Rican. She's a minority, and other aspects which we all have to be supported. And the legacy is so important. And documentation, especially for women. No one's doing it for us, so I was told very early on, you have to try and do your own. So everyone needs to do their own documentation. And also for Bill, I wasn't aware this was the first issue, and how tremendous the work En Foco has been doing for so many years. And I don't know if they ever did Sophie the first issue because she was a woman in Puerto Rican. I just assumed what a goddamn photographer she is. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
I just want to thank the panelists for sharing such wonderful stories and anecdotes about Sophie. It's really a treat to get to know not only her work, but her life in a more intimate way. My question is a little focused more on her work specifically. Nina and Rocio, you sort of called out Sophie's sort of techniques, whether it was like with the camera in the dark room. Nina, you mentioned like the double exposures. Rocio, you mentioned like this really lovely halo that she did with her portraits. And I'm wondering if she ever spoke about that, maybe not in a technical way, but in a conceptual way, like maybe why she enjoyed employing those techniques, especially because she was, I think, making work around a time when documentary style photography was very much like still in vogue, and maybe those techniques were somewhat discouraged, but I'm wondering if she ever talked about those, I guess, techniques in a more conceptual way, or if they were coming from any art heroes that she might have been inspired by during her life.
Oh, I think a lot of it was, you know, when you have a lot of spare time, you know, as an artist, I mean, you know, summers and so forth, you're locked in the dark room and you're, you know, you're playing around with, I mean, all these methods and I guess, you know, the kind of freedom you have when you're not with a gallery, or you're not really, you know, torn to, you know, go off to a job. So I think because of that extra time and the extra kind of roaming of, you know, the imagination and the kind of like non-conformist sensibility of a woman you know, and the kind of expectations aren't placed on you can I think expand, and hanging out with like painters and poets and so forth really gives you an extra sensibility, you know, for me at least, that worked. And having different age groups of people, it's really, you know, the best to have that those connections, you know. And I think, you know, New York too, you know, being away from the galleries and away from, you're not derivative in that sense. You know, you're kind of like going in at your own pace, even though many people have done montage work or double exposure, triple exposure work. It's different for each person if you really collect all the kind of like experiences that you have for the decades. So it's going to be a long time for the artists. You know, you know it's not going to be, you know, like one show or, you know, a couple of group shows. It's this whole thing, and having, you know, En Foco people and other photo groups. It's, you know, the feminists were, I think, always, you know, argumentative too, and that gives you a lot right there. You know, another battlefield.
It's a really good question. You know, when I spoke to her, I don't remember us having a conversation about her reflecting on it in a more conceptual way, but I will say, you know, in her youth, it was radical times, and she was doing documentary, in some cases just straight documentary photography. She did some publications for the Liberation News Service. She's done some photographs of protests. And I think that for her, her artwork was the opportunity to do something completely different, which would lead to that thing, that the playing with the double exposure. And also with the children, I think especially she did like a whole series of children in the playground with the double exposure. Also thinking about how children never sit still. So it's almost like you're seeing the child move in the photograph, even though it's a still. I also just wanted to say for the gentleman that asked the first question, you know, what might be really interesting to tap into also, the Caribbean Cultural Center and the Museum of African Diaspora and Art in Brooklyn. The Museum of African Diasporic Art and the Caribbean Cultural Center would be both, I think, really fruitful places to visit, just because they've centered that Afro-Latinx experience in all of the work that they do. And they had a really good, I think it's still on their website, they have a fantastic photography show on their website.
There's Malta Moreno is involved with Absolutamente Negro. You should look that up. I was actually a part of that show a few months ago in St. Croix.
Beautiful.
So it's about the African diaspora meeting the Caribbean, and how we as individual artists are defining that. And it's not specifically a photography show, but you have mixed media, you have all different kinds of mediums within that, but it touches upon that topic. And don't quote me on this, but that show has since come down, but it's not the end of that show. I believe the show is going to travel, and they also have engagements on Zoom in which they have conversations with panelists on this topic, right? And that's, you know, getting to know who you are, where you fit in, and how you can grow from that space, right? So look it up, Absolutamente Negro.
Hi, it's Linda here. Hi. I just wanted to reflect more about Sophie's work and her influence on women. I had the pleasure of working with En Foco when I transitioned out of corporate publishing magazines. I was in magazines for about 10, 12 years. And I had to say that seeing a woman photographer featured was like a unicorn sighting. And so when I left publishing, because of what was happening technology-wise, that's when I decided to cross over into nonprofit, and En Foco opened up, and I have the pleasure of working with Marisol and meeting all these photographers. But Sophie was the unicorn that I found, and I was just like, photography for me always spoke volumes to me as a child, and it's the baseline of my work that I do now. But having the opportunity, I remember Marisol and I being together, and she'd be like, Sophie's calling. I'm like, okay. And you know, we would take turns talking to her, because it was just wonderful having to hear her experiences and her reflections about the industry, about being Boricua, about process. And I had ventured off into grad school at that point, and then I ended up doing contract work for publishing, and then I met a young woman who was actually scanning Sophie's files that were salvaged from the fire, and it was just a very casual conversation. And I feel horrible because I forgot her name, but I'm trying to see if I could remember it. But she was helping Sophie scan what was salvaged from that horrible fire. And then when I heard of her death, I was really, my heart broke. And like I said, if I had to describe her work, it was grace and grit. And it was just beautiful summation of how she portrayed people in New York and Latinidad and being Boricua, and kept me, I guess, inspired to keep doing my work, even though I'm not out there, but I know I can keep just síguelo, just keep doing it. Thank you for letting me speak.
Am I missing anybody?
So if there are no more questions, you know, we'll wrap up here. Just thank all of you guys for sharing your experiences and your expertise with us. Thank you guys. Shameless plug time. If any of you are media artists, the En Foco Media Arts Fund Works in Progress Fund is still open until the 27th, which is a Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Please visit our website for more information. You're welcome to sign up and meet with us, and we'll work through your applications with you. And we invite you to some light refreshments to continue the conversations with us out in the hall. Thank you.